This is Dr. Patrick Stinson with a presentation about emotional systems, broadly speaking. This presentation will go from the bottom up and get into a few new ideas about moving the idea of emotional systems, and particularly human emotional systems, to something more modelable, to ideas that are more modelable. By modelable, I mean being able to put together mechanical predictive devices, to put it technically, to get towards real research, to do simulations that demonstrate the emergent properties of at least human emotional systems. So this is a bit of a theoretical speculation. It just gets into ideas that are kind of starting points for research models, but are not actually demonstrable or demonstrated yet. But I think that they get to be a little bit more precise than the way that emotional systems are currently described in the Bowen Theory literature. So the problem I'm trying to tackle here is that it's difficult to employ or deploy the theory outside the Bowen network. So it's for some reason it's difficult to talk about Bowen theory, to use the ideas in Bowen theory, both in professional practice and in research. There's always some kind of a gap. It's hard for others to understand what you mean, and that this is a problem for a theory that is aiming to be scientific. So I have two reasons for this, or two explanations for this. One is the subjectivity in the actual terms used, that is the incompleteness or the vagueness, the imprecision in the actual ideas. And of course, science is about predictive precision. So that can be a problem. And I believe, well, I've discovered through a lot of work and experimentation and trying to operationalize the ideas in Bowen theory that there's quite a bit of work to be done to get to that point. Another cause is going to be this term from the Bowen theory literature called observational blindness. Murray Bowen came up with it. And I think that this is probably right, but I'm not sure that it's really workable. I'm not sure there's much you can do about it in the scientific domain. So observational blindness just means that what we're talking about in this theory are phenomena, namely, say, that the phenomenon of anxiety that literally alters what you perceive. So we're trying to describe that phenomenon, but it's very difficult to be an observer of that phenomenon in research because of the fact that it literally functions to alter your perception. And so that's true in researchers, that's true in the people it's being applied to. And so it's very difficult to talk to people about something that they can't see without putting a lot of effort into it. But this is a dangerous one because it's very easy for this to create an in-group, a special group who has the special ability to see, and for that to become a kind of dogmatic container for explaining away imprecision in the terms. So if the theory isn't quite there yet, and it's like, well, no, this theory is actually pretty solid, but they just don't get it, that can really stall progress in the theory. It has that potential and that danger anyway. So another problem is that it's not really very clear exactly how to connect individual models of emotion and individual models of human functioning that are scientifically based with Bowen theory. It's always sort of an axiom that that the individual is a system and that it is contained within a larger system, i.e. the family or unrelated work system, whatever it is. But there aren't theoretical concepts that precisely connect concepts from individual models with the systems model. And that one isn't always apparent. It kind of has to be outlined with some explanations, but I've got, I think, a start on that. as an example for a way forward with that. So all of this to say also that, especially the first few bullet points, that this Bowen theory as a scientific theory is not a complete project. And of course, if you're going to apply a theory in practice, you have to just take it, you're cashing in your chips on however precise that theory has become. You're not necessarily improving the theory. There can be kind of a iterative feedback loop like Murray Bowen did in the beginning, but that's not something that people do day to day. So, the theory is not done. And the declarative language in the theory can sure make it seem like it's done. The use of the word fact can seem like it's done. But really, technically, at this point, without predictive models that prove or demonstrate the claims that are made across families, really it only provides broad directions for research. For example, that the family is involved in the functioning of an individual substantially. That is something that you could probably research today. But the details of how it works, which is what Bowen theory describes, is not quite clear for organizing precise research about those predictions. So these are just a broad set of problems, but this is kind of a broad conversation. So in summary, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through an individual model of emotion. I'm going to start from the very ground up, from the axiomatic level, and then get into specific ideas. You might call them concepts, you might not. I'm not sure where that line is. But then I'm going to locate the ideas in that individual emotion model into a systems model of emotion as Bowen theory describes, using the collective intelligence and collective behaviors research. And the last part, which is always has the potential to be quite a stretch, is to add a few more guidelines or a few more markers in the sand about what a ninth concept of Bowen theory could potentially describe. And that will go in the same general direction as Murray Bowen and Michael Kerr, but I think aiming at a higher level of precision or objectivity. So progressing, hopefully. So this presentation is at the axiomatic or heuristic level. What do I mean by that? The language used in science proper when critiquing theory, scientific theory, is that you always have some logical axiomatic presuppositions. You always have some assumptions that you bring that are probably kind of untestable, but that at least form a starting point for you to start moving into the testable domain. So in that way, they kind of function as a heuristic in the sense that they are a mental model that helps organize thinking, but these are not formal theoretical concepts. Maybe they're there, but I'm not clear enough for them to be there. And I don't have the examples to back them up and all that or the predictive models. So in other ways to say that these are not demonstrated in these particular terms may remain axiomatic. I'm not sure. But that is at the same level of precision that Bowen theory is today. And I've made that case in other presentations, particularly the role of modeling in scientific theory, which lays out an argument that Bowen theory has not been demonstrated and then the criteria for doing so. So it's status quo in that sense, but heading in slightly different directions. So the first section is laying out an individual model of emotion, a theoretical model of emotion, or at least some ideas that might go to that. So, and this is beginning at the very bottom level, that presupposition level, axiomatic presupposition level. That if you're studying behavior in a biological system, you're going to assume that that system possesses some kind of guidance system, and that this guidance system is predictable enough in its functioning to study and model. So with a guidance system, every biological organism is at some point or state in one moment in time, and in the next moment in time has to make a choice on how to move forward. That can be an increase in heart rate. That can be moving to the left. It can be moving to the right. Who knows? But the question is, how are those decisions made? A biological organism is a constantly oscillating dynamical system and a constantly behaving system. We do divide it up into discrete units just so we have something to think about, but the assumption is that there's this kind of a continuous stream of decisions that are being made. For example, like I was saying, like move left, move right, scratch your back, talk to someone, make a noise, fall asleep, defecate, whatever, and how much or something like that. How urgently to get there is kind of another factor to throw in there. So the question is not necessarily what are these decisions, it's not quite the right way to think about it maybe, but how are they made? What is this guidance system? What are the rules of the guidance system? What's the algorithm? So if you can model that, you can say that you understand how that system works. A couple of basic starting points for that is to start dividing the types of decisions into approach and avoid decisions. And these are like some of the oldest motivational assumptions in biology. Motivations are invisible variables, that's something you assume exists in order to explain something or, track what's happening. But you can't, it's an assumption really in the end. But these are very old ideas, approach and avoid. So moving towards something means that that thing has value to the biological organism. Value is kind of a human word, but it's like moving toward or approaching that thing or that state means that state was selected among a hierarchy of prioritized value. So that's another way to start organizing what's being observed. It's at different times that organism is going to value different states or places or things to move toward. So it's an assumed that this is a basic framework for any behavioral biological research. Right, so getting a little more specific here. So how about a definition of emotion? The word itself, emotion, is motion. E is short for the Latin ex, which means out. It means moving out, something like that. I don't really know how the etymology works beyond that, but we're talking about any kind of movement in physical space, internal and external. So the basic idea is that emotion is a vector. This is the idea that's going to be throughout the presentation. It is a vector for movement or for the mobilization of energy. A vector is a strange word. It may be better to have specific versions of vector for specific systems, but this is a broad conversation. So a vector in physics is direction and speed. What to do and how much. Toward what will you move and exactly how fast? And if you're moving away, well, you're moving toward safety, let's say. So it's just always towards. And that this is the output of the guidance system, is the information part. It's like, well, I've got a certain number of movements that I can do. Which one am I going to do, and how much energy am I going to devote into that? So the basic information processing model, to put this into a system that has steps in time, is that raw information is coming in from the senses, both internal and external, so inside the organism and from the outside world. That raw information is passed into what I have called an implicit model, which is that organism's model of the world, such as it knows the world. And a series of steps are happening, but the output of that model is the vector. So it's information in, processing, in order to produce a vector which determines behavior in every case. So these are axioms. So let's break these three steps into three parts here. The first phase is sort of simple. it's just dividing the senses up, the channels of input, let's say. You've got sight, sound, taste. Those aren't particularly interesting for this presentation. You've got touch, which is interesting, and specifically internal touch, which is the most interesting for this presentation. But also that there's internal, or external. So external touch is going to be fingertips and the skin, anything on the outside that's coming in contact with the body anywhere. And then internal is going to be what people are starting to call interoception, but it's the, I guess, somatic feedback loops that are processed and guide behavior, that influence the vector of behavior. Another one that's kind of interesting is the mind, and maybe as a feedback loop. Now, keep in mind that the reason I'm putting this in here is because input is defined as anything that's considered in the model that determines behavior, in the guidance system, the implicit model, the emotional system, all the same thing. So, you know that it's a fact that a person can have a thought or something, some mental content that will impact their behavior, and that thought had no immediate external source. And maybe this is actually part of the internal touch. I'm not sure, but just to say that there is this, that there can be contents of the cognitive system that and maybe there's parts that aren't cognitive, I don't know, but that contents that that can drastically alter behavior without something coming in through the other senses. So that's an interesting thing to consider. So the most interesting one is the implicit model. The implicit model is synonymous with guidance system or emotional system, actually. And what it does is it outputs a vector. In order to do that, there's a few basic steps that I'm outlining here. And the goal is for all of this to be in line with the current neuroscience research. Antonio Damasio is a great one. His latest book has got a lot of these same ideas, that probably not formulated in quite the same way, but this is not just meant to be philosophical speculation. This is meant to be in line with demonstrated research, so experiments. So the first step is that it perceives, and that's receiving that raw information that's coming up, and that is recognized, meaning compared against some kind of a memory system that has a storage of the past, broadly speaking. That organism has short-term and long-term conditioning that serves to as a model, if you will, and using a different way, for that raw sensory input to be compared against, and that literally is the definition of what's meaningful. So we know from the perception research that there is an incredible amount of information that comes into the human sensory system, and that almost all of it's filtered out. It's just ignored. So the stuff that's not ignored is the first phase of what is meaningful. It's what's considered. And that it goes into the next step, which is some kind of subjective impression. So it's recognized into be some kind of way for that organism to handle the information in a meaningful way. And that literally is the subjective impression. It makes a constructed representation of what that raw information is. And so I'm calling these localized representations of objective reality. An example of this is going to be, for example, if an office or a paper company is a system, this is an analogy, that paper or that company is going to make paper and sell it to people. And that system is going to have all kinds of tools and techniques and workflows and experimental history and lingo and all this kind of stuff that is internal, it's localized, it only pertains to the process that occurs inside that system. It is a way for that system to make sense of what's going on around it, but only in line with that system's goals and in a manner that isn't really very useful outside that system necessarily. And that's what subjectivity is. I've never really had much of a problem thinking about subjectivity and what it is, subjective impressions. I'm not saying I've got it right or anything like that. I guess I've always just been satisfied with that explanation. So there are examples for this in software as well. Internal variables and external variables and stuff like that. Contracts between components. But anyway, so these subjective impressions are used to make a prediction about the future. And this is the idea that the neuroscientists are using, that the neural network of the brain is a predictive device, and that guides the generation of emotion, more or less, or the generation of decisions. So the prediction is what informs the vector. It's like lion, oh no, I understand lion to be death subjectively, and I'm going to predict that that's going to lead to my death, and now I'm going to get out of here. That's the vector. And I'm going to do it very quickly. But if you 1 second later notice that the lion is a stuffed lion, then you might change everything. So, but this is all automatic. This is the emotional system. This is happening very quickly. It's more or less deterministic in the sense that that's not quite right, but in the sense that it takes a lot longer to change. Maybe even evolutionary time to change. So I wanted to keep this consistent with a lot of ideas from other theoretical systems. One being Bowen theory, of course. It's like, well, what is this, if this is the emotional system, what does it mean to have a more defined self? What does the human act of defining self mean? And I thought one thing it might mean, have to do with anyway, is increasing the internal consistency of the model. I mean, even since Freud, there's been, or even previous to Freud, the Greeks had ideas that you wanted the energies in your body to all be flowing together and not be conflicting. And so this is something like, you just don't want you don't want the goals of the system to be conflicting against itself. If you've got that paper company, you want all the people to be oriented towards the same goal. If you've got a human emotional system, a single person, you want the different automatic parts of the body to maybe allow each other to be prioritized over each other, to work in concert and coordination as opposed to just all firing at the same time. And having your basic metabolic processes happen when you're trying to run away from the lion or something like that. I mean like the large intestine, gross level metabolic stuff. So there's got to be this consistency in the functioning, and Freud called it conflicts, if I remember right. And Jung called them complexes. These things that were kind of mashed together and not very well defined. So that's just an interesting way to look at it. In Bowen theory, a technique is to define self in this way, is to make one's model of the world explicit. Look at one's automatic functioning, which would be the output of this implicit model, make it explicit by verbalizing it, maybe even writing it down, and so that it can be compared against reality, so that maybe the kinks can get worked out. There's something about that bleeds into the implicit model to where the automatic behaviors might even change a little bit, which is an interesting phenomenon. I don't think we understand much about that. The third phase, the output, is emotion. So here's another idea that's important here. There's three big new ideas, I think, in this presentation. The first is the vector, emotion as vector in individual and collective systems. The second is this Bayesian prior idea, or the Bayesian model of emotion, really, where the prior is a part of it. Emotion is the Bayesian prior. It's a vector for behavior. So what is this Bayesian thing? Bayes' theorem is a way to make decisions based on past and current, maybe future data. Well, it's a way to make decisions based on past and current data about future data, to make predictions. And, this is another mathematical idea, but it's a way to organize the relationship between thinking and feeling, or thinking and feeling / emotion. So emotion is the Bayesian prior, and the Bayesian prior is combined with the Bayesian posterior in order to produce a prediction. That's the point, is that they're both considered together in order to make a prediction. And I'll just give it away that in this model, the Bayesian model of emotion, the Bayesian posterior is the thinking system. It's the intellectual system. So emotion is everything that's automatic, from mouth-watering to back pain to the triangle, as described in Bowen Theory. It's extremely fast in functioning, it's rapid, and it's concurrent. It has lots of different pieces happening at once and working together. This is the evolutionary output, evolutionarily conditioned output. It is fast and concurrent because it works so much that it forms the baseline for behavior. It literally dictates every action. And it occurs immediately prior to every action. So there's a vector for behavior that guides every action, gross and subtle. Now, this occurs in a window of time about 1 to 5 milliseconds. So it's happening in this window of 1 to 5 milliseconds, which is an interesting window of time. I worked in producing software instruments for real-time music performance, for live performance. And at the time, in the mid-2000s, 5 milliseconds was about the requirement for maximum latency from when you hit your finger on a keyboard to where the sound came out the speaker, for it to be realistic, for it to feel realistic. And I think the standard's actually gone down a little bit, but we really only get down to about 2 or 3 milliseconds for software processing time, and the rest of it is actually hardware, so it ends up being about 5, I think. But it's an interesting time of window that this automatic response is happening about that amount of time from the sensory input, and that it takes about a millisecond for information to travel from one end of the brain to the other. So just some interesting notable numbers. Now, at the individual human level, I'm going to say it's a fact that this sort of thing is occurring over the body all the time. I don't know you can prove this, so I should not call this a fact. But fact is used in a way in Bowen theory that, I think probably needs to get updated. It is the way that Bowen used it, and it's something like, something that no one really contests well enough, and you can proceed with it. And I think maybe everyone, if fact is something that no one contests, let's say, virtually no one contests a piece of information. It's so obvious and self-evident that it doesn't really need to be tested. So, and I think Bowen at the time was probably using observational facts, where I just have to assume everybody on the ward, on the NIM project, for example, was in agreement that that's what was happening, that there was this inside position, outside position of the triangle once he formalized that concept. That mother's functioning went down when daughter's functioning went up, things like this. But it's when you get into the details about how to track this objectively, it's kind of difficult. So I'm saying this is a fact in a similar way. This is coming from my experience with Vipassana meditation. And I took this quite seriously for quite a while, a number of years, about 10, and at least so far, where you run an experiment by practicing sitting still for those, especially in the early courses, those 10 days, where that's all you're doing all day and all night. So you have this controlled experiment, and everybody reports roughly the same thing. But that there's these little impulses going on, little sensations that you can pick up all over your body, and you can get to a point where you can feel them more. That you're kind of ignorant to what's going on physically until you actually sit down and start working on this. And that it's just painfully obvious, literally, that there's little oscillations and impulses occurring all over your body all at the same time. And that every time you make any kind of gross level behavior, like getting up, for example, or twitching or itching your back or whatever it is, that it begins in this window of time with a little bit of an emotional impulse, which is detectable in a physical sensation. The sensation actually is what is reacted to, and that happens in about this amount of time, 1 to 5 milliseconds, I'm estimating, and that is happening all over the body. To me, that's good enough as a fact, so I'm just kind of proceeding with it. I can't prove it, and I'm not going to try. But I don't think it's also unreasonable at some point to be demonstrated, if it hasn't been already. So given that, like I said, you can learn to develop the ability to detect these objective phenomena in increasing detail, although it's very difficult, and I would never ask anyone to do it because it's so difficult. You can do that by holding your attention on a part of your body long enough to be able to feel something subtler than you were able to pick up before. A little softer, a little weaker, but also important in the broader scheme. So you pick those little somethings that you're picking up being the sensations that all together inform the direction for behavior, this vector of emotion. Now, what's very interesting about this, and some kind of an argument to add to this being a fact, if you will, is that psychotic people seem to have a completely different relationship with physical sensation in the same way. And I don't know as much about this. There might be other people that can explain this better, but my experience has been that you can't even really talk about this with people who have a psychotic break or have had that are that dysregulated. I haven't had any experience. It's like talking to that person about them sitting down and focusing and practicing and putting effort in systematically increasing attention in order to detect something that's more and more subtle physically, that's objective. It's not just an idea or something like that, or a fantasy. I've never had that idea land with somebody at that level of functioning. And another point on that this is actually something I've been told more than experienced, is that people at that level of functioning also can become very dysregulated if they put effort into that practice. If they try to turn their attention away from ideas and things outside to calm down and detect those subtle oscillations going on and just kind of feel how the body is working with internally, that can be pretty dysregulating and can even lead to psychotic symptoms and that kind of thing. Some of that is coming from observations in Vipassana courses, and they have strict requirements about who should enter into these courses and who shouldn't, because they're pretty difficult. If you're somebody at that level of functioning, then it's not a good idea. And then also from psychologists that I've known, colleagues that have corroborated that observation that it can be dysregulating. So that's really pretty interesting, because one thing you might pull from that is that people at that level of functioning, that the more contact you have with your body and are able to observe what's occurring internally as it's informing and driving your behavior, in order to be able to choose whether to follow it or not, for example, the more you can do that, the more potentially developmentally mature you are. If a psychotic person is lower on the developmental maturity level, that this is a proposition of Bowen Theory, that it's harder to separate fact from fiction, that more opinions and identities and even physical emotional functioning are modulated by the social environment rather than something autonomous and unique from self. This suggests that, not strongly, but it's an interesting thing that there might be something that this ability to detect the output of the implicit model of the emotional system may be fundamental, not just self-regulation, but maturation. So that's just very interesting idea. Okay, so one last little thing on this one is that this is one of these kind of axiomatic situations where, or not axiomatic. It's where the little vectors of emotion that are popping up in your toe and your back, and in your, you've got a headache, and if you can feel enough, then you can kind of tell that it's actually kind of linked to your back and that's how you're holding yourself and all this kind of stuff. It's not really clear how they all interact. Even to me, I've put a decade into this practice for some longer periods, many hours a day, or at least a couple hours a day regularly. And I still can't explain or even give a theoretical concept for how the smaller vectors interact to produce a gross behavior, but it's clear that they do, and I can't explain that. So here we are in speculation and musings. So that's the idea of an emotional system at the individual level. But why this term vector? Well, I think that this idea has been represented in a number of theoretical systems. Freud had drives, and for example, and there are others. Those are usually categorical, nominal ideas. It's hard to compare them, but and vector gives you kind of it implies that there's a few different variables involved. There's a trajectory and an acceleration, for example, and so different vectors have different directions and intensity, and but also that there's something about the language that's more objective, it's more precise. It gets you into categorizing them and comparing them and maybe even stacking them up into a hierarchy. How I was saying that, at different times, a different vector is going to be chosen, and you might track that and try to define some predictability in it, and so the relative priorities of those would fit into a hierarchy. So this is moving towards more modelable ideas. Right now, Bowen Theory has a few propositions that are pretty interesting. It's very difficult to model, if even possible. I have had no success producing a simulation of a family. And so this is just trying to get some footing on some ideas that are a little bit more objective that can move to that kind of modeling. Also, in terms of modeling, the collective behaviorists are literally using vectors as literal objective data for biological systems, for decision-making in biological systems as it pertains to physical space. So it is a literal match for that sort of thing. When you're trying to model the way a school of fish moves together, you're literally tracking those fish and where they are in physical space, how fast they're going, what direction. So there is a precedent for this in the quantitative biology area. And I'm actually going to get to that in a second as a way to connect this idea from the individual level to the system level. But there's a problem in Bowen theory. This is something I discovered through a lot of toil. Bowen theory describes invisible variables, and it means that it gets into assumptions, psychological assumptions that are not objective enough to be modeled. There are kind of these ways around that kind of thing. There's an idea called a latent variable, but you have to, that would explain the relationship between other objective, non-hidden, non-latent variables. I'm not going to get into that here, but for example, when someone moves to the inside of a triangle, the proposition from Bowen theory is that an inside of a triangle exists, which means an outside of a triangle exists. And then it also is proposed that occurs in order to manage the tension between two people, the tension or anxiety, depending on how you want to explain it. Now, or another way of saying that is a person moves to the inside to get comfortable in relation to a third. That's an invisible assumption. It's a very interesting way to describe it, and it may be perfectly reasonable to have that in a theory, but you can't, you don't see the actual tension and comfort. It's like tracking the wind. You know, you can see that the leaves are moving, but you don't actually see the wind. So it's just important to distinguish between what's objective and visible and materialistic and what's supposed or invisible. So Bowen theory has a lot of these, and it's not like you're tracking movement in physical space. This is a problem. And so a vector is just, it's a way to organize what's being output in kind of a more information processing model. So the train of thought here is that if psychology, I'm a psychologist, and I think this actually is a psychological model, technically, in the sense I'm about to describe, that if psychology is studying that which is predictable in human behavior, then you have to, by definition, you're tracking the guidance system. You're trying to outline the rules that determine behavior for the human being. If you have rules like that interact over time, you have an algorithm. And if you have an algorithm, then you have something like the implicit model that gives the rules and lays it out in terms of a vector of emotion. It's the model of that organism has of the world that produces predictions in a continuous stream of predictive decisions and guides behavior. So the implicit model is another word. These are all synonyms, more or less. The implicit model is a formalization of an algorithm that defines the guidance, the rules for the guidance system, which is the fundamental aim of psychology in terms of hard science, in terms of psychological science. Okay, so here's a twist. And this is the third idea in this presentation, aside from the ninth concept coming in the third section. This is the third, I'm trying not to say concept, but new idea in here. That the first was vector, an emotion as vector. The second was the Bayesian model of decision making. And that actually, I'm going to talk about the Bayesian posterior next. But I'm going to throw another idea in here because this is a function of the Bayesian prior. So before we get to the posterior, this is a function of the implicit model, and it includes one source of variation, a primary source of variation. Everything I've had so far is this deterministic, robotic, mechanistic model, a stimulus response model. But there's different ways that information can be generated at different times. So this is a different definition for anxiety, a different direction. Murray Bowen gave the definition that anxiety is a response to a real or imagined threat. And that, in my opinion, is quite a contribution. It gets the valence, the emotional valence out of the idea of anxiety, upon which psychiatry absolutely depends, and even behaviorism. They're both using these very, very subjective, sort of diagnostic, symptom-oriented definitions. This gets you out of that because sometimes anxiety is good, at least in Bowen theory. It requires a different definition. So it gets the good or the bad out of it. It can be either or, and it depends. So it's response to a real or imagined threat. It also throws in this perception recognition type of thing that I was saying is occurring in the implicit model. It doesn't matter if the threat is objectively accurate. What matters is the way it's perceived, and that is the way I lined out in the implicit model. The problem is that this can be pretty subjective when you try to really systematically apply it to people. What's a threat? Is that a threat? Is that a threat? Wait, was that response a threat? How much of this is real or imagined? This is what I meant in the beginning by Bowen theory being kind of a broad guidance for research, but it's not a precise data model for research that can be proven. It's not even wrong in that sense to use that phrase. So something to move a little bit more modelable is, this is my definition right now, is sufficient combination of uncertainty and urgency. It means that when there is enough of urgency and uncertainty for a problem, that there is a response that necessarily follows. And that response is the initiation of a search path. So search path is a term from computer science, and there's actually a number of biological domains that use this term sometimes, even in collective behavior, actually, which is pretty cool. So the idea is that there's a problem that's meaning that it's a problem, and so the solution needs to be found for it. So that's the uncertainty part. And that it's urgent enough to really crank up the response. So a search path is going to try to find a solution to the problem. It's when there is a problem with an unknown solution, that's uncertainty, and it has to be found. So what do? You start, all your senses open up, and you get, cortisol release and all these, and adrenaline or whatever it is, and you're activating, mobilizing everything in order to find an answer, to take in as much information as you can. And you might just say that's scanning the horizon for a solution. That's kind of the poetic way I've put it. But to get more precise, that a search path is initiated. And this term implies there's predictability in the way that the solution is sought out. And not deterministically necessarily, this is biology, but that there's some pattern, and the goal is to discover the pattern. So what is a search path? A search path is a particular strategy, and you could call it search strategy, for finding a solution among a set of unknowns. In computer science, there's two really basic search paths. They're actually tree-based search paths. There's depth first and breadth first. Depth first is, imagine you're a rat in a maze. It's where you keep on making new decisions as to go left or right or whatever until you hit a dead end. And if you haven't found what you're looking for, then you go back one step, and then you go down until a dead end. You do it again until you hit a dead end. If you don't find it there, you go all the way back to that first step I just mentioned, and then you go down the next one. So you're going all the way to the end of the tree as much as you can before you're traversing the breadth of the tree. The opposite, breadth first, is the opposite. It's where you go down one step, back one step. Down another step, back one step. Down another step, back one step, if you have three options. And then once you've gone all the way across your first options, your first decision, then you go back to the very first decision, the first option in that first decision, if you can imagine it, and then do the same thing over and over again. So in both of these, you just reiterate. This isn't to say that this is what's happening with anxiety, that these search paths are happening. That's analogy. But what I am proposing here is that a search path is literally what's occurring in the anxious response. That this can be a definition of anxiety that is more modelable. So you may have things that people in psychiatry call anxiety that don't match this definition. Well, then that wouldn't fall under my definition of anxiety, and that my definition of anxiety is meant to go in a particular direction. There's a question of whether it goes there or not. It's meant to be modelable. So the search path is aimed at uncertainty. And the reason or the evidence for this is not only, like I said, it's like you get aroused, you get your sense channels open up a whole bunch, your eyes get really wide, you start breathing a lot, you become sensitive and reactive to touch, to sound, all these kinds of things. And that will stop if the problem becomes more predictable. Often. For example, people die without reactivity because they've gotten clear on the things that are unclear and important to them. So the second part of it is urgency, and this is the variable that is important because, so let's say you've got a car and you're driving down the road and you're going faster and faster and faster, and well, that mechanical system is going to start shaking and wobbling and maybe even will flip off and fly off the road if it goes too fast. So there's a threshold before things start to become unstable. And so what this definition is saying is that the search path is initiated. There's a problem that with an unknown solution. It needs to be found. And then the more urgent it becomes, the faster that search path is executed, the more error that happens. And this is the key idea. Because the kinds of things that we're interested in most in Bowen theory is when there's so much of an anxious response that the actual response becomes a bigger problem than the original problem the response was to. And it's diminishing returns on the solution, basically. It's where, like, you can have a kid that scratches their leg, but then if the parent comes along and gets so reactive to it that they think the kid is actually going to die, then it's going to send the kid into a really anxious response, and anybody that gets roped into that is going to potentially add to it. So it's where the problem creates a feedback loop, or the response creates a new problem entirely. That would be the basis for the projection process and the idea of psychosis, actually, in the extreme, and that kind of thing. Interlocking triangles and those societal examples and that kind of thing. So the idea is to cut down on that error rate. How far is the response missing the mark? And when the urgency is cranked up, when the lion is right there and you got to get away, is the response going to be so strong that you're going to trip over a rock and the lion's going to get you anyway? So this is all still part of the Bayesian prior. This is part of the implicit model, the emotional system, the guidance system. And the problem with this, like I mentioned at the very beginning, was that the anxious response literally functions to alter your perception of reality, because in order to really devote yourself to something, you have to believe in it, so to speak. You have to be convicted. You have to have the conviction that it's true. And so that makes the anxious response difficult to observe in oneself. So the practicality here would be, okay, I can see I'm anxious. That's step one. This is an anxious response, as opposed to just carrying out the anxious response. Like, I just heard that something that my boss is getting rid of half the people in the company. Well, am I in that half or am I not in the half? I don't know. The problem is that you're uncertain about your future and its urgency because it's happening tomorrow morning. So are you going to go react and start gossiping and then creating more problems, or maybe go yell at your boss because you actually think that you're getting fired and it's for a bad reason? You think that'll, save your job. And this is all just kind of what if, where the first step would be, wait a second, I'm having an anxious response. What would be more thoughtful? The second part would be, what is the uncertainty here in this response? What is the uncertainty that's generating this response? The urgency is clear. It may not be as urgent as you think, but you can't really change that very much. Practically, it's what's the uncertainty. So you start picking it apart systematically. You calm down, engage that neocortex as much as you can, etc., in order to engage the Bayesian posterior. So this is the same. This is synonymous with what is called the thinking or intellectual system in Bowen theory. Just to reiterate the Bayesian principle, it's when you need to make a prediction about the future, you're going to take what you know of the past, and in this case, it's your evolutionary past. That's the emotional system. The initial vector outputted by the emotional system / implicit model that has taken in the sensory input of the moment and very rapidly and concurrently pumped out a vector or vectors for response. That's the Bayesian prior. So the goal of the intellectual system is going to be to inhibit that Bayesian prior just enough to consider it for what it is, but also consider the Bayesian posterior, which is the product of the intellectual system. It's taking in information from the present. It's turning on the senses. It's getting more objective. It's learning to observe so that a decision can be made. And so the Bayesian model of emotion is meant to resolve the polarity between thinking and feeling. It requires getting objective about the prior, about the emotional response between 1 and 5 milliseconds to be able to see what is happening, because we almost see zero of that. And the more animalistic we become, the closer we get to animal behavior, the more determined we are by that prior, by that first response. The goal is to learn to identify the vector in that response. Now I want to throttle that boss. Now I want to eat that ice cream, and I can tell because my mouth is watering. That's the prior. So you need to be able to observe it. That requires the intellectual system, because the intellectual system is an essential component of observation. It's the part that makes us human, for example. The problem, or not the problem, but an aspect of the intellectual system is that it's slower and serialized. It's not a whole bunch of things happening rapidly all at once. It's one thing happening at a time in order. And that's where the accuracy comes in. So you can't process as much information, but small bits of information can make a huge difference when taken with care, and that's the function of the intellectual system. So it can override the prior if the prior can be identified, if there's enough objectivity, and if reactivity can be inhibited just enough to identify the prior and get that posterior running, then a better overall vector can be combined. So that's the Bayesian principle. You take the prior and the posterior, they're both vectors. The intellectual systems can say, well, I know that eating this ice cream is bad because I know I can't have milk. Something like that. But your mouth is still watering, you know. And so it's to take that consideration. It's like, all right, well, yeah, I can see that my evolutionary past is saying eat this, but today I'm going to consider the intellectual system. Maybe tomorrow I'll follow my impulses and throttle my boss. You know, who knows? But this is what I think is an interesting model that gets you out of an either or with feeling or thinking, which is, I think, a deeply unresolved polarity in our culture and even in the clinical field. There is a lot of the clinical field, the behavioral field, behavioral health field, that in my opinion is overly or exclusively focused on the output of the emotional system. You know, it's feeling. It's what is your opinion, and that's the main material. And then you have a few smaller areas. Bowen Theory would be one of them, that is introducing this idea of the intellectual system and how they work in conjunction. You know, and then you have CBT, that is maybe all intellectual system. I don't know that that's right, but it's a way to think about it anyway. So going back to the meditation model, you know, this particular type that I am familiar with, Vipassana meditation, and for those who are interested, it's Vipassana in the tradition of Sayaji Ubakin and Essing Goenka. You know, every tradition has their strengths. This one is interested in objectively observing the automatic generation of sensation, which I'm, for research purposes, calling a vector of emotion. It's an automatic impulse to behave in a certain way. And that's, at least in the beginning, the goal is to be able to detect what those are, observe them objectively, and then over time that observational capacity actually bleeds into that automatic generation and changes some of that behavior. But the goal is just to be able to increase the amount of time that you have before you act out the prior, so that you can choose, so you can include the posterior, consider the posterior, and then combine them to a better, more informed, a vector that's more informed with your goals, behavior that's more informed with your goals. Now, Bowen Theory is the other system that provides a substantial, I'm trying to stay away from the word effective, because that's actually pretty subjective, I think, but some kind of substantial and sophisticated system for observing that prior and combining it with the posterior. It doesn't do it at the individual emotional system level as much, or, well, it doesn't do it at all in the way Vipassana does, but it does, what it does do is it does the kind of the same observational process, and you might even argue triangles are a concept that could traverse the two systems, the two levels of analysis, individual and family, for example. But it shifts the observational level of analysis to the family emotional system or work system or what have you. But at least the family. To observe that emotional system and the vectors of emotion that occur in the individuals, much in the same way that they occur in the pieces of the body that you can detect in Vipassana. And of course, a easy entry point, one of the easier entry points into that is try to see triangles while they're happening. For me, I began with Vipassana, and that helped me see triangles because I thought, wow, I'm pulled toward this inside position to get away from that inside position with that person, toward this person to get away from that person, something like that. So that is going to be an individual model of emotion. That's the richest part of this presentation. The ninth concept is going to be rich as well, but not as long. So the next step is to locate that model within, locate that individual model within a systems model in a more precise conceptual way. This is not something that happens with Bowen theory much, beyond, let's say, neurological or neuroscience and the functions of different structures and how they may, for example, the relationship or the fact that the prefrontal cortex probably has something to do with the thinking system, things like that. But the vector idea really comes into its own here. This is really what it's about, I think. It connects the two levels of analysis. So the individual, as I was saying, the individual emotional system is outputting a vector. For example, in a debate, each person is arguing a certain case, something like that, although what I'm talking about is really the emotional response. So like how, I'll just keep explaining this. So the question is, how do they combine into a system, into an emotional system, if that's the output of the individual components? As with the individual body, it's unclear how they do that, but it's reasonable enough to say that they do. We just don't know how it works. So this is getting into some of the detail, though. There's a theoretical basis for this from the collective behavior and collective intelligence literature, which are tightly related. The collective intelligence literature, I think, is the most theoretically rich. Because if you're modeling a guidance system, you want to model how it makes the decisions it makes over time. So if you're modeling the group as a decision-making system, then you're modeling how effective or ineffective that group will make decisions in accordance with certain independent variables. So this is a theoretical basis. This field of literature actually gives a theoretical basis for what we call democracy insofar as it manifests in biology. It doesn't completely manifest in biology, but there are ideas that are similar enough that we might learn something from the way biological systems make decisions. So the key idea is that each vector, each instinctual, fast response that occurs in the individuals in that system serve as votes. This is why vector is interesting, in my opinion, because vectors can be averaged out, or one extreme vector can pull an average in one area, that kind of thing. And that the votes are tallied in that way. They're kind of combined through the instinctual reactivity that's going on between individuals in the system. So the fish models that are being produced out of the Max Planck Institute that demonstrate how fish shoaling behavior can work, which is schooling behavior, it demonstrated that it's a few very simple rules that are occurring in real time that each fish is paying attention to what's going on around them and reacting to them, and that's it. It's trying to stay a certain distance depending on what's going on with a predator, for example, and it has a certain field of vision, and it averages out the vectors that it can perceive from the other fish and this kind of thing. This is where So this is what's meant by instinctual reactivity. Another example of that in humans is, let's say that you have people that are trying to make a group decision, like you have a bunch of residents, medical residents, deliberating over a diagnosis. One person can be totally convinced, and if on their own they were asked, what is the diagnosis for this patient, they may say, yes, that's my final answer, and I really believe it. But it's a common occurrence if you watch any deliberation that people will dramatically change their opinions often when they see others don't agree. Even on just a small and seemingly inane level, you can just watch that sort of thing, the step-by-step transaction that occurs in a group. So that would be instinctual reactivity. It's very fast, the decision changes very quickly, but in the end, you get a group decision. So the implicit model defines that reactivity, defines the what, how, and when of that reactivity. What will the response be? Or will it be a non-response, which you could catalog as a response? How will it be carried out, and when exactly will it happen? What will be the characteristics of that response, the variation in that response, and then when will it happen? That's what the guidance system produces, instinctually. And that's what an emotional system is going to be. It's how a collection of instincts work together. So the takeaway here, or a takeaway from the collective intelligence literature, and there's all kinds of experiments in this area that are, I'm not going to be able to encapsulate, but an interesting takeaway is that the average vector is often most accurate, or that's what can be taken. And that's going to say, like, if you have, the classic example with people is if you have a whole bunch of people estimate the number of jelly beans in a jar just by looking at it, and then you take the average of all of those answers, then it's going to be more accurate over time than a single person who has tons of experience estimating. So that's a pretty interesting thing. The example with the residents is that if you take a single expert at the top of their field in that particular medical scope of practice, and then you have a whole bunch of residents, there's an experiment I saw on that where there are conditions under which the residents are far more accurate. And it's something about the diversity in the opinion. Well, another takeaway in that is the diversity of opinion idea. It's that when you start, as long as the individuals take their, get their information from different places and end up with different opinions, then by virtue of the central limit theorem, you end up with a more accurate estimate from the group. So that's one independent variable. Another one you could say is group size or gender or that kind of thing. And there are conditions where those are helpful and conditions where they're not. But that's what collective intelligence decides. So vectors in the instinctual reactivity in emotional and biological systems as decision-making systems serve as votes. The vectors serve as votes. And that they're tallied, you can just start and say they're averaged. But that's a way to connect the individual model of emotion to a collective model of emotion. So the collective behavior field is similar. It's less theoretically rich, actually, I think. I'm not an expert in this field, but I think it's less theoretically rich. I think the theoretical richness is coming from the collective intelligence literature because it's describing how decisions are made. But there's so much overlap between these two fields as well. So it's almost like it's not even worth saying that. But in collective behavior, they're studying a particular kind of decision, which is movement through physical space. The cool thing about the collective behavior research is that position in 3D space is perfectly objective, and you can measure it in real time mechanically with high sample rate, and it would just be the output of the decision. So the thing that's interesting about it is that it's a basis for models for the less objective domains like collective intelligence and Bowen theory. It's just a starting point to work on it. They're not translatable, but it's a starting point. So that's where the vector idea comes from. One of the coolest collective behavior / collective intelligence articles I saw was from Ian Cousins' group. It was a synthesis of lots of their research over the past few years, and this was, I think, December 2021. I can't remember. It has to do with the vectors of decision making. They literally tracked the physical position in space as a few different neurologically divergent, so very different species like gnats, and I can't remember what the other ones were, and how they approached several decisions, several potential targets, and then incrementally chose between them, and that they would average out the points, and how that average out the distance between the immediate options, and then choose one of them based on which one was closer at a certain inflection point, and then they would continue on, and then repeat the process for the next decision among potential targets to land on. And this was a quantitative analysis of these decision-making processes across species. So this is a way that physical space and the vector of decision-making, or the vectors as a decision-making mechanism, can feed into these broader, less defined areas like collective intelligence. Although that wasn't a collective intelligence article, it does have to do with decision-making. And then you can measure the efficacy of the decisions, for example. Okay. So that was an individual model of emotion with the idea of emotion as a vector, which plays a part in a Bayesian decision-making model. That is, it plays the part of the Bayesian prior. It's automatic, it's fast and concurrent, it's it's working on evolutionary time, where that prior is the product of the statistical past. It's a statistical prediction based on the evolutionary experience of that organism, of that system. And then it can be combined with the Bayesian posterior, which is synonymous with the thinking system, which considers information from the present and makes a prediction about the future. That vector idea can be synthesized into one level of analysis up to where how that individual decision, automatic or slightly thinking-oriented, informed vector, can be combined with the vectors of others into a collective intelligence mechanism. And that the collective behaviorists are the ones who have the most quantitative models that can serve as a starting point for others. So that was to sum up this whole previous bit. So what's interesting about this is that it has a way, I think, to dig a little further into a ninth concept idea. Now, Bowen and Kerr have a way of writing and thinking about this, which I think is pretty interesting and informed plenty of this. It actually informed the basic direction that I'm taking with this. But I'm trying to get more precise. I think, the idea of spirituality, Bowen is saying, explaining spiritual phenomena, that kind of thing, how can you explain its function? Kerr is talking about the function of belief, kind of similar, I guess. And I've got a little bit more detail to add, I think, to get a bit more objective. I have a more objective definition. So we'll just see where this goes. It's reasonable enough to say that there's going to be shared output from the emotional systems of individuals and even groups. And that, as I said, the output is a vector to move towards something, or toward a state or a position or a thing. And you can just call that values. That means you're valuing it, which means you're prioritizing it over the other choices that were available. These are axioms. So those patterns that are shared of shared vectors that are shared the most are what Jung was calling an archetype. He used different language for it, but his idea for the archetype concept was for it to be grounded in biology. It's a biological idea that actually transfers across species. He didn't mature the idea formally across species. He talked about that. He talked about it being deeper, pertaining to our evolutionary past, that it is so shared because it has been refined over so many millions of years. So Jung was thinking in a timeline of millions of years, which was one of the breaking points of Freud. He's saying this is a very, very sophisticated output from what they called the unconscious and I'm calling the emotional system. So this is literally what the archetype is about. It's the patterns in the vectors, or you could say shared values, something like that, that are the most shared. And then he was talking about how they show up in narrative form and that kind of thing. And okay, great. That's a choice of observational data that you're using to form an argument for this. I'm not really going there. I actually really like that area. I think it's very interesting, but I don't know what to do with it quantitatively. So this idea is in line with this Bayesian prior or emotional system idea. The vector idea gives it more substance. It's the shared vectors, because like I was saying, one of the reasons the vector idea can be used is because it's a way to compare them. Say, well, these are all similar. And I can't do that in a factual or even demonstrable way, but again, this is just a starting point. This is an axiomatic level. So it's a product of the Bayesian prior. It's automatic, you don't choose it, it's shared. That's what the archetype is. He said it was from the collective unconscious, which is that in which you share with the species, and possibly even further back in time than our species. So this is the information component of guidance, or the guidance system. To connect it again to Jung's terminology, it's what you aim at. That's what an archetype functions to do. They're the recurring, broadly shared themes of things that are good and bad, which is value, which is the toward and away, approach and away component of the vector. It's what to prioritize over all the other options that stand in front of you in that moment. If you go back to that first slide, that all biological systems must move through time and they have to make decisions. So that's literally guidance. Now, what's interesting about Jung and Bowen is that I think Jung and Bowen actually stand apart in some particular similarities. First of all, they're thinking about evolutionary time and not the time of human culture. And they had this idea that because you're a part of a species that has evolved over that unfathomably long period of time, you share more of yourself. You share more than you have unique with the rest of the species, than you have different from the rest of the species. And that the maturational path is to be able to distinguish between what is coming from the Bayesian prior, which is shared, more or less, and what it actually originates in you. And Jung used much vaguer terms for this. He used the word self, actually, as Bowen does. Bowen got a little bit more kind of engineering-like with it, as I'm doing with the vector here, I think one step further. But the idea, individuation, was being able to tell the difference between yourself and others. And to be able to act out what you believed. And so he actually used the word differentiate for what you would do with the functions in his typology, for example, to be able to tell them apart, to be able to choose between them. Now that is exactly what Bowen was talking about in principle. They use different words, they use different observational inputs, let's say. Jung got way off into phenomenology, and Bowen was more interested in staying in touch with scientists that were around him. But and I think that the people who have pursued Jung's ideas are also following in that tradition of phenomenology and subjective experience, and diving into that as opposed to the biological origin or basis for this idea and pursuing and fleshing out exactly how that works. So this is a cross-species idea for a guidance system in terms of collecting the patterns in what that guidance system is outputting across the longest periods of time, and that's what archetypes are. For example, we all have some sort of idea of a picture, a painting of heaven, that's supposed to be good. And any of you that are listening to me probably have an image that is somewhat similar to mine with some similar characteristics, light, clouds, things like that. So a beautiful sunset, or whatever it is. And that's because we share that it's not just cultural. It's deeper than that. People who don't, there is something that's good that would be assumed to be good in that cross-culturally. And this is not provable, but it's one of those things. So similarly with pictures of hell and death and all this kind of thing. So there are patterns. It's an axiom. That's an archetype. They're refined over a million of years. They're automatic, and they're automatic because it's worked that long. So ninth concept in particular, maybe a different way to put it, is how do you account for models of behavior, inferred models of behavior in humans that are objectively false but adaptive, where the actual content of the model has been demonstrated to be false, but that believing in that model enough to act it out is actually adaptive? Because there are times like this, there are cases like this. People who have an organized religion that supports the institution of marriage tend to stay married longer. And the explanation for that may have to do with God and some tenets of that faith, and those may be untestable, and they may even be demonstrably false. For example, for the inference of the age of the earth, that's demonstrated to be false. But that doesn't mean the belief may not have a function that's more adaptive. And that can be very interesting. It's just a fascinating question. So under this, I think you account for what Bowen was calling spiritual phenomena. And I think that you account for Kerr's idea or question, what is the function of belief? And my best articulation of that is going to have to do with this implicit model idea and the processing of sensory information that have to do with predictions that send you in a vector, possibly even among a collection of vectors from others, that is demonstrably or factually false, but serves a role in that system, for example. That sometimes, Carl Whitaker fell on the floor on purpose once in front of a family he had in family therapy in order to trigger a certain response in that family. Now, what he did, that vector of behavior, was, you could say it was objectively false in accordance with the goal of that group, which was to put the family in better shape or something like that. But it had a particular effect, and the way I think about this is that you can send out an extreme vector that pulls the average in a different direction, and that it's easy, especially in a scientific society and among atheists, for example, to get overly concerned with what's objectively false and lose the broader view of the function of that objectively false model in the broader context. So it's interesting to ask, how if there's a model for behavior, how much of it is implicit, how much of it is explicit? I'm going to say religions are more implicit. The definition of God can be written out explicitly, but it's not proven. God hasn't been proven to exist, and I would say the idea of God is not even wrong quote unquote, in the sense that you can't test it. But it's not. It's that might not matter. Maybe in some cases it does. Maybe in some cases it doesn't. It's the function of the belief that puts religion in the scientific domain, in the sense that you can contain it all in one single frame of reference. That doesn't have to be an either or. You can engage in religious belief and the fact that people believe it and have to believe it to act it out. Act out that more adaptive behavior. The question is it being adaptive now? And that's a question that has to be reapplied in every case, at every time, in every moment. So the person who wrote the most about this was Ken Wilber, I think. About this sort of the evolution of the psychological models, of the implicit models and explicit models of human history, starting back from, I can't remember where he starts, but Stone Age, something like that. And that we are in a time of systems thinking where that's kind of a challenge. It's just after the modern time where science and explicit models really come into their own. And then there's systems thinking where more complex interaction of phenomena are being considered. And then going off into the future are a few predictions about what he's calling postmodern and some other terms. Integral is the last one. It's kind of this ideal. But, and that's not, I don't know what the evidence is for that kind of thing. Ken Wilber, like Bowen, talks as if he has lots of evidence, and then draws conclusions based on that evidence. And I don't know what the evidence is, but I do think that he's written the most about the evolution of what you could call the implicit and explicit models that have guided human behavior, let's just say. So, just to sum up, there's some kind of an inkling of a ninth concept here. It would describe the function of subjective impressions, not necessarily spirituality. I don't know what that means. And I can assume I know what that means. I'm probably a spiritual person, but I don't know. But it would at least describe biologically, or in effect, the dysfunction of subjective impressions that are objectively false but adaptive. I think that it requires the completion, the maturation of Jung's archetype concept. That the essence of the archetype concept has a place in behavioral biology. That Jung applied it to humans in a particular way that got very, very involved in subjective impressions as such, and that you play with those in order to process through the emotion contained therein. And that I just walked away from that because I thought that was limited in what you could progress in terms of hard research. And I'm interested in hard research, while I'm fascinated with Jung and always have been. So this depends on emotions as vector for behavior, and that there are shared patterns in the vectors produced by an emotional system. And those shared patterns that are shared the most, particularly across the species, are going to be archetypes. Heaven, hell, God, that kind of thing. The wise father, all this sort of stuff. That an archetype is an evolved ideal. So it would be going back, resurrecting Jung, probably not going into the subjective stuff so much, but getting into what place it has in a measurable biological sense that can be modeled and simulated in terms of the vectors that are produced in the emotional system. So all of that to say that the goal for humans is to be able to observe that prior, to choose between, to be able to produce a posterior in the Bayesian principle. It's difficult to produce a posterior, that gets the uncertainty and anxiety down, which can often reveal that the urgency in the anxiety was not as much as it once appeared to be, and that can be a way to hit the mark, to move towards the archetypes more efficiently. That it can help to coach people to think while they're anxious, talking about problems that they have difficult time, getting that uncertainty down, that a coach can actually engage them to help them think systematically about that prior, to observe the prior and not get rid of it, to say it's a fact that this feeling is occurring. What vector is it pointing me into? How does that match up with the evidence ahead of me? And then also, which is the Bayesian posterior, and then how to put together a plan, which in itself requires you to define a problem, which cuts down the uncertainty about that response. You can have an anxious response about a problem you can't even define. If you can define a problem, then you can begin to put together a plan, and both of those steps in themselves can cut down on that uncertainty and calm a person down. The end result being that they may see that it's not as urgent as they thought, or that there simply is nothing they can do about it right now, which means that their error rate in their response, the energy that they're putting into this, automatic or otherwise, is more efficiently going to where they want to head, which of course is everyone's goal. And so that would be the synthesis with this. The collective aspect of this is when you are placing that anxiety in relation to an emotional system, especially a family, which Bowen Theory is proposing, is saying is the most powerful, most pertinent, and substantial context in which anxiety is generated, and that it's so out of view that it does take coaching to be able to put together the facts to see that, or to disprove that. So that's it. I think this should become an article, but until then, this is a fairly long exposition on some ideas that hopefully can get a little bit more precise about ideas that have been in Bowen Theory for quite a while, and possibly even some of the older psychologists. Thanks for your attention.